Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all so much for taking time out of your all's busy schedules to listen to and participate in the 2023 lecture series of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. Our stories, our museum, 50 years in the making. And this evening, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome a colleague. Now, we're both now retired, but Professor Pedro Welch. We go back many years, and we both know each other very well, and we work together in the Department of History at the University of the West Indies. So it's a double pleasure for me to be honored to be asked to chair this session and to say a bit about Professor Welch before he takes over and speaks on the topic, documenting our national history, the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And in brief, this presentation seeks to extract, for the benefit of a discerning public, aspects of the subject matter published in the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society over the period from the inauguration of the journal in 1933 to the present. It takes note of the preoccupations of the various editors who represented in the presentation as products of their own social underpinnings. It is expected that a greater interest in the journal will be generated as a result of this introduction to its sphere. And I can say this last sentence, very important one. I speak without fear of being contradicted when I say that the journal of our museum, the Barbados Museum, is, I would say, unparalleled within the English-speaking Caribbean. I had the honor to have been editor for 20 years prior to Professor Welch taking over from me. So therefore, I know of what I speak. This lecture series is put on under the aegis both of the Barbados Museum and of the Department of History and Philosophy of the University of the West Indies. So let me take a minute or two to introduce to you who don't know him, Professor Pedro Welch. Professor Welch is a retired deputy principal of the University of the West Indies. In 2017, he was conferred with the title of Professor Emeritus by the UWI. He has also served previously as Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education and Professor of Social and Medical History in the Department of History and Philosophy at the University of the West Indies. He is the recipient of a number of awards. These include a Commonwealth Scholarship in 1984, in 1992, Johns Hopkins Fellowship, and in December 2009, the Principal's Award of Excellence at the University of the West Indies. Professor Welch has written or co-authored several books and articles, including Red and Black over White, Free Colored Women in Pre-Emancipation Barbados, published in 2000, and Slave Society in the City, Bridgetown, Barbados, 1680 to 1834, published in 2003. And in addition to being the editor of the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, I can again say it was my distinct pleasure to have, as one-time editor, to publish numerous articles of great interest authored by Professor Welch. He has delivered several public addresses internationally in the USA, the UK, France, and Canada, and in several Caribbean countries, and has appeared on BBC television broadcast in the UK and on NBC broadcast in the USA. He's also delivered numerous public lectures in Barbados, and he is the current chairman of the Task Force on Reparations in Barbados. He's married to the former Joan Winter, and they have 2 children, Dr. Pedro A. Welch, MRCSGP, and Jem Welch, a graduate of the UE and a teacher of the Maria Holder Nursery School in Barbados. He is an elder and organist of the Breath of Life Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so, without further ado, I now invite Professor Pedro Welch to take over and speak to us again on the topic, documenting our national history, the Journal of the Barbados Museum, and Historical Society. Break a leg, Don Pedro.
Thank you very much, Carl. I'm very, very happy to be here this evening, and certainly very happy that I've been introduced by a colleague, Carl Watson, the longest serving editor of the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. You said 20 years, but I think it's closer to 23. 23 years as editor of the Journal of this prestigious institution known as the Barbados Museum. In addition to that, of course, Carl served for many years at the Mona campus and at the Cayfield campus of the University of the West Indies. I wish also to greet those who are watching online or connected to us via the internet. And I also wish to greet those who are our colleagues from the University of the West Indies, who may be here with us this evening, as well as colleagues from the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. Permit me to thank the staff of the museum. I wish to thank Harriet Pierce of the library, and I also wish to thank Kay Hall and others of this institution for the tremendous help which they've offered to me as I prepared for this lecture. Before I go any further, I wish to again acknowledge the fact that we are celebrating the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and particularly of our journal. I'll be sharing my screen in a moment because it'll be useful for me to do so, so I can share some of the things that I have here in my lecture with you. So this evening, I intend, by way of an examination, that is with some added commentary, an examination of various publications of the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society over the last 90 years, to open to our view the important contribution which the journal has made to Barbadian historiography. That is not to omit mention of the wider contribution to Anglophone Caribbean historical writing. You must, of course, also be aware that the several editions of the journal over the 90-year period of its existence constitute a voluminous archive in its own right. And thus, the presentation this evening represents more of a selected summary than an exhaustive survey. We begin, therefore, with a survey of the formative year of a journal's existence, tracing the intention of its first editor and significant others as they inform the public of what the subject matter of the journal would be. From the very start, the editors, or maybe say compilers of the journal, reveal the class origins that will shape the direction of the narrative that would occupy these first writings. Indeed, we will let them speak to us. So we note in volume 1, one of the issues of volume 1, you have various numbers. Published this one in August 1934. We read, and you should see what we read on the screen. I'm trying to get this screen to shift. It hasn't moved. I'm trying to get that here, but I'll tell you what it says. It says, with regard to the historical activities of the society, material dealing with old Barbadian families, pedigrees, entries in old family Bibles, diaries, as well as notes and queries on these subjects, and on topographical questions are wanted, I will continue to make their appearance. Now, so we see immediately from reading this, and I'm still trying to get this into the so you can see it yourself. I'm not seeing it, it's not shifting. So I'm going to have to stop my sharing for a while. Yes, and I'm just trying to get let me see if I can get this done. Well, I'm getting some assistance even as you speak to see if we can get them to shift this. It should, in fact. Yes. I just think we may have to stop share and bring it back in again. Okay, let's see what happens in a moment. And once we get that sorted out, we'll continue. Right. Let's see what happens here. Okay, while we're working on that, I will continue to speak. And again, I repeat that the editor of this is the first edition of the journal, make it abundantly clear that the focus will be on questions of the lives of old Barbadian families, pedigrees, entries in old family Bibles, etc. This will suggest to me that the major focus will be on matters that do not necessarily include the working classes of Barbados. That is in the very early edition of the journal. So that the interests, as I'm saying, do not center on the wider Barbadian population, the majority of whom could hardly qualify in the minds of the editors as being of quote unquote old Barbadian families. In fairness to these old, the first compilers, we could hardly expect them to have any particular interest in the family histories of the working classes, given the focus even in the elite schools of the island at that time on a standard fare of English history. That is, the educational background of the founders of the Museum Society and of those who make up the editorial staff of this new institution. These were more geared, the education background was more geared to the reproduction of the mores and values of the mother country in this little England outpost than to any major consideration of the cultural lives of the rural workers. You must note, however, to their credit, that notwithstanding the class origins of the founders, there were some elements in their statements of purpose that suggested that they were not so irrevocably class bound, that some attention outside of the pedigreed cohort of the population might not be entertained. Thus, they also inform us. Yes, can you go back over here? Yes, and this is where I am, that one. Yes. Thus, they also inform us, and you now have this on the screen, the history, development, and present status of peasant industries such as fishing, pottery manufacture, and so forth, and of the main agricultural operation with which the island has been associated, such as sugar and cotton cultivation, syrup manufacture, etc., are all subjects worthy of study and record. So what I'm saying is that while we acknowledge the class origins of those who are the first editors of the journal and their interests, we also acknowledge that they're paving the way for future developments in the production of the journal. Additionally, in this first journal, they extend their interest to articles of scientific interest, such as those which have already been published on the geology and bird life of Barbados. Further, they were willing to consider for publication submissions that dealt with the old, quote unquote, the old Indian communities and their relics which they have left behind. In our survey then, we are given some insights into the introductory historical material that will characterize the early journals, the early journals of the Barbados Museum of Historical Society. And we are given a background on which the development of the journal up to our contemporary period can be traced. Within this context, therefore, we look at some of the articles which appear in the journal in the first 15 years of its existence, following which we will continue our examination over other years up to the 1980s as we foreshadow our contemporary period. In volume 2, number 1, published in November 1934, we find the first departure from the genealogical fair, which forms the major concern of the compilers. On pages 23 to 31, a piece is presented entitled The Treatment of the Negroes in Barbados in 1786 and 1823. The first of these treatments consists of recommendations for the treatment of the enslaved, to which are appended the names of the prominent planters of the 1780s: Edwin Lascelles, James Colleton, Edwin Drax, Francis Ford, John Brathwaite, John Walter, William Thorpe Holder, James Holder, Philip Gibbs, and John Barney. This paper, published in London in 1786, offers a somewhat benign view of the treatment of the enslaved and more or less presents these planters as enlightened landlords concerned about the welfare of the enslaved property. The second paper, which is published at the same time, is represented as being a copy of a broadsheet, apparently signed by a Mr. Foster Clark, again one of those old, represent one of those old Barbadian families and planter families. Over the years, the compilers will publish other papers covering the era of enslavement in Barbados. Of special interest to us is the editorial in volume 12, number 1, published in November 1944. It writes about the experience of a young Englishman who was, as the editorial puts it, sold into slavery. The editor clearly had an interest in the fate of the so-called indentured servants and represents that, and I quote, though, and that's now on the screen, though it is of doubtful privilege to claim that the original slave workers in Barbados were Englishmen and men from the then independent kingdoms of Scotland and Ireland, it is nevertheless an historical fact. This is of particular interest because as we are looking at the quotation on the screen, the claim that the editors advance is that the original slave workers were Englishmen. And by the way, what I'm saying here is not an indictment on our first editors. It's just simply to look at these what we call the status of the historiography at the time, what they understood from the historiography. Further, It is further represented by the editors, and you have that representation on the screen as well. For many reasons, it soon became very difficult to run plantations with white slave or near slave labor. And eventually the introduction of slave Negroes from Africa became a trading concern. I've taken the time to put this here because I'm giving you an overview. I'm giving you a survey of what we find in the journal in the early years. The passage of time and the development of a historiography that has moved us beyond simplistic explanations for the development of slave systems in the Caribbean permit us to question some of the assumptions presented by the editors. In the first place, as Handler and O'Reilly have argued, indentured European servants were not slaves. And it is misleading, if not disingenuous, to identify them as such. This is not to say that indentured servants were not at times treated very badly. And in that regard, we do well to note the commentary of Richard Ligon. And Ligon writes his history of Barbados in the 17th century. And this is what he says to us. As for the uses of the servants, it is as much as the master is merciful or cruel. Those that are merciful treat their servants well, both in the meat, drink, and lodging, and give them such work as it is not unfit for Christians to do. But if the masters be cruel, the servants have very wearisome and miserable lives. In considering the similarities between African slavery in the New World and the course of indentured servitude, however, it should be observed that while the servant might be viewed as having a status akin to that of a species of property, there were legal limits to that designation. Indeed, as Hilary Beckles tells us, Professor Hilary Beckles tells us, it was a servant's indentured time, this is contracted labor power, which was marketed, and not the servant's self, as in the case of the enslaved. Indeed, we might note that in a diabolical twist of the regulations governing involuntary servitude, West Indian enslavers from the early pioneering plantation enterprise in Barbados ensured that the enslaved female, African female, transmitted her status to her offspring. That was not the case with the indentured servants. And so the editors of the journal in their commentary were really reflecting the prevailing historiography of the time, the prevailing views of the historiography. We may note also that the distinction between Africans and whites was codified in the passing of the first slave code in Barbados in 1661. As Richard Dunn observes, it classified the Africans as an heathenish, brutish, and an uncertain, dangerous kind of people who were not fit to be governed under English law. In 1688, the English settlers passed an amended slave code that repeated much of the assertions of the early slave law, declaring that Africans were of, quote, barbarous, wild, and savage nature, and such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of our nation. At clause 5 of this law of 1688, severe penalties were prescribed for any African, enslaved or not, who had the temerity to strike, quote unquote, any Christian. Thus, another distinction that came to differentiate between Africans and indentured servants was the question of their religious orientation. Interestingly enough, when Africans adopted Christianity, as many eventually did, their earlier identification as being brutish, that means almost animal-like, barbarous or savage, continued to be applied as a justification for denying them fair access to equitable systems of justice. Another legal distinction between Africans and indentured servants had to do with the question of redress before the law. So on the 1st of December, 1703, an act for the encouragement of white servants was passed, and this servants gave white indentured servants the right to have a complaint against a master or mistress heard before two justices of the peace. However, enslaved Africans and free cutters were not granted or guaranteed such rights. It's not intended to make this issue the main element in our survey of the journal over time. However, it's simply intended to illustrate the assumptions that might have colored some of the editorial writings of the early journals. And it is also our intention to assert the privilege which later generations of editors such as the late Anthony Phillips and the very much alive Carl Watson, and the still very much alive Pedro Welch. We now have privileges that those editors don't have. We have greater access to a greater selection of sources. And in that context, therefore, our attention now shifts to the publication of an article in 1944, which perhaps marks the editorial policy of the journal at that time as being at its best. We are speaking here of the article authored by Bruce Hamilton and published in volume 11, number 3, May 1944, on pages 115 to 131. This article, entitled "The Barbados Executive Committee, an Experiment in Government," is perhaps the most detailed study on the evolution of British colonial policy on the question of governance in Barbados in the period between the abolition of enslavement and the early 20th century. It provides an excellent survey of the conflict between the colonial office and the Barbados House of Assembly at a time when everywhere else in the Anglophone Caribbean, the British colonial leadership has succeeded in installing various forms of Conconi government. The matter of change in the political governance of the Caribbean colonies could be dated back to the year 1839, when the Jamaican House of Assembly went on strike and refused to facilitate the passing of money bills. This was in response to the passage of the so-styled West India Prisons Act, through which the British government sought to reform the prisons and the wider judicial system. The British saw this as an opportune time to reform the political system as well. It was not, however, until after the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865 that the Jamaican Assembly, afraid of the growing restlessness of the emancipated classes, capitulated and permitted the colonial office to install Conconi government in Jamaica. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, Conconi government in various forms was installed from about the mid-1850s. That is everywhere except for Barbados. Hamilton's article is very detailed in exploring all the nuances of the political system in Barbados. In particular, he identifies the roles of two prominent non-white Barbadians, Samuel Jackman Prescott and Conrad Reeves. The latter being, of course, the first non-white Attorney General in Barbadian history. In the end of the process of political change, an executive committee was installed, which marked the end of British attempts to reform the political system in Barbados and kept the House of Assembly very much in its original shape. This thus avoided any installation of Conconi government in Barbados. By publishing Hamilton's piece, the editor of the time had kept faith with the self-importance of the upper class cohort of the Barbados society, while demonstrating that the journal was quite willing to accept scholarly works for publication. In the first 15 years of the journal's existence, readers then would be exposed to other scholarly works, Hamilton's work being one. There are many other scholarly works, scholars from overseas, from England, from the United States of America, from Canada, from within the Barbados, from the Caribbean generally. Other aspects of the journal's publication content in this early period of its existence included publications on the flora and fauna of Barbados, some of which were authored by some quite respectable experts from prestigious institutions. Persons who have been seconded to the museum also pen some such articles. That's in volume 7, number 1 of November 93rd. Then just step back a few years. There was a submission entitled Marine Zoological Exhibits, which the editor apparently transcribed from notes and paperwork left by a Mr. Robert S. Booch of the United States. Booch, a holder of a bachelor's degree, as it appears, was seconded from a US institution to the museum. And the result of his labors was a fairly comprehensive collection of marine fauna, which at the time was displayed at the museum. Butch received his BA in 1936 and his MA in 1941 from the University of Iowa. He later received his PhD in zoology from the University of Michigan in 1941. His career as a preparator, that was what he was called at the time, began in 1937 at the Arrowhead Museum in Minnesota. In 1938, he moved to Barbados as chief preparator at the Barbados Museum and served until about 1939. His career ended on a high note when he served as curator and then director of the University of Michigan Exhibit Museum. He retired in 1986 and died in the USA in 2005. I mentioned him mainly because it is to illustrate that the journal's content include submissions from persons who want to become quite distinguished in their careers, persons who are clearly well recommended for their expertise in the subject area that they were involved with, museum exhibitions and as preparators. In this first phase of our survey, then, we note that we also note the many valuable extracts published by the editors, such as those from the St. Michael Vestry, the Barbadian newspaper, and extracts from the collections of Nathan Lucas. Lucas, born in 1761, served as a member of the council in Barbados. He was apparently educated as a surgeon, but as the owner of Mount Clapham Plantation, spent most of his adult life in the political sphere of the island. He collected volumes of material covering a multitude of topics. In some cases, we are only privileged to understand elements of Barbadian history because of his meticulous collection of extracts and documents. The Barbados Museum's journal, under the superintendence of various editors, is by virtue of its publication of several of Lucas's collected works, a valuable custodian of important aspects of Barbadiana. Lucas died in 1828, but the Barbados Museum is largely responsible for making his prodigious collection of works and artifacts available to a discerning Barbadian public. The editors, early editors who sought to place these extracts, as I mentioned, extracts from various Barbadian newspapers, the Barbados Mercury, and other newspapers, other periodicals. But when they placed those in the journal, they were in fact doing us a favor. Those editors were seeking to provide for us material from which we could build our knowledge of Barbadian history. Have in mind the journals then of the 1930s and 40s. We now do a brief survey of the period of the 1950s and into the 1960s. The pattern laid for the content and production of the journal in the early period continued to characterize the 1950s and 60s. As we survey the first of these latter periods, we know that some of the earlier focal emphases continue to appear. Thus, in volume 8, that would be volume 17, number 4 of August 1950, you find extracts of the Barbados Mercury of the 1780s. We find records of the Barbados House of Assembly for 1815 to 1816. And that is particularly interesting for us, those of us who have an interest in what happened in the period of the Boston Rebellion. And I'll deal with that in a couple of moments. Of interest especially, there are also records of the vestry for St. Michael from the 1690s and other periods. Of interest even to us in this contemporary period is the Assembly's take on the bus rebellion of 1816. This is reported in the journal as follows, and I'll give you that in a moment. Remember, this is an extract from the Barbados House Assembly minutes located in the journal. I am emphasizing the point that the journal had become a repository, a custodian of important historical memorabilia from important periods in Barbadian history. And so if we look at the report in the journal of from the House Assembly of 1816, and this is what it says: the introduction into the Imperial Parliament of the Slave Registration Bill have been taken up by the Assembly as an infringement of the colonists' rights. The slave population misunderstood the character of the bill, and incited by a free colored man named Washington Franklin, they revolted against all authority. The insurrection commenced on the 14th of April, 1816. Martial law was proclaimed, lasting on the 12th of July. Now, I'm spending a couple of minutes on this because those of us who are privileged to have access to the journal in this current generation, we will see that we have moved past some of these early discussion explanations. This extract that we just looked at serves to date the evolution of explanations on the origins of the 1816 rebellion in contrast to the current understandings. In our contemporary period, based on evidence emerging some 60 years after the 1816 rebellion, when there were labor disturbances in 1876, Bussa is the only name carried forward from the earlier confrontation. That is why there's no doubt about the involvement and leadership role of Washington Franklin in the 1816 rebellion. There's equally no doubt that a following generation viewed that rebellion as General Bussa's war. In that context, the decision of our contemporary generation to accord Bussa the status of a national hero of Barbados holds up against the historical record. Apart from simply transcribing these various extracts, however, the editor also introduced other things to us. I only stop on that one about the Bussa rebellion because it is a way of contrasting what I must say, a contemporary historiography, what would have been available to us in the early years of the journal. One of the things that the editors included in this period that we look at now is a most interesting article by Iris Bailey entitled "The Whistling Frogs of Barbados." And when I read this, when I went through the journals, and when I went through this particular one, that one gave me a lot of amusement because I don't know how many of us in this contemporary period can recall sitting down at night, maybe in a gallery somewhere, veranda somewhere, and being annoyed by the constant peeping of these whistling frogs, and my ignorance was revealed because as I read the article, I became aware for the very first time that the free frogs did not originate in Barbados. If anybody has told me that these tree frogs, these whistling frogs that we have over here, were not of Barbadian origin, if anybody told me that they have migrated here from St. Vincent or Dominique or Guyana or some other place, I would say yes. But here we have a situation where it is clear from Iris Bailey's investigations and published in the journal that these are these are foreign import. And I read from her article. The little tree frog, Hylodes martinicensis teshudi, is undoubtedly a very recent introduction. 20 years ago, it was quite unknown. It has now spread, and she's looking at a source of the 1880s. So 20 years ago, meaning the 1860s. And she said it was totally unknown. And then she goes and say it has now spread over the entire island, and until the air gets accustomed or dead into it. And that really caught my attention, because I know that our contemporary audience will certainly identify with this. The monotonous, incessant chirping of this frog through at night during rainy weather is enough to drive a person distracted. I mean, very interesting article. And again, I've extracted this one because it serves to illustrate the wide fare of the journal over the years. In other words, yes, we can look at the class origins of the editors, we can look at some of their focal interests, but at the same time, we also have to recognize that the service that they've done for us in putting into the journal wide aspects of Barbadian history, Barbadian folklore, Barbadian flora and fauna. Many examples are in the journal, which should tell us something about its importance to our historiography and its importance for our understanding of our history. Another important publication in the journal, this time in volume, this is volume, I think this will be 11, number 1, November of, volume 19. Yes, number 1 of November 1951 is an article by John Newman entitled The Enigma of Joshua Steele, from pages 6 to 20. This is volume 19, yes. Few Barbadians of this contemporary period that we are in now will be aware of this Englishman, Joshua Steele, who at the reputed age of 60 travels to Barbados in the 1780s, where he takes the ownership of Kendall Plantation in St. John. Steele acquires ownership of this plantation, we are told, according to the norms of that period, by virtue of being the husband of one Sandra Osborne, whose husband had owned the plantation. She had herself inherited that estate, another property, from this late husband, Robert Osborne. She gets married to Joshua Steele, and he travels to Barbados at a time when a debate on the moral rightness or otherwise of enslavement was beginning to emerge in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. Of special interest to us then is an experiment which Steele introduces on Kendall Estate. We append a relevant extract in this experiment as follows, and this is what we're told about Steele. It says in 1783, Steele reported the abolition of arbitrary punishment of his slaves on his plantation, and the institution of a Negro magistracy for slave offenses. In 1785, he reported his system of obtaining the labor of his Negroes by voluntary means, instead of the old system of violence. Under the system, Steele required a certain amount of work to be done a day for a small monetary reward, regardless of the time it took to do it. Now, most of us, I think many of those who are watching on today will hardly have been aware, unless you either were an historian yourself or had access to a lot of the information we now have, will hardly have been aware of Joshua Steele and this experiment in Barbados. The journal has done us a favor again, has done us a service by having this article by John Newman in the journal. 1950s, it helps us to get another perspective on what is happening in Barbados, the kind of discussions that are taking place. And if some of us who are familiar will know that that is a work by Dixon on Barbados. I think there are a couple of works. My memory may not be strong on this one, but I think in Mitigation of Slavery is one of them. Letters on Slavery, and in that work, Dixon speaks at length about Joshua Steele. So there is a tremendous amount of information here. As we gaze into the museum's historical advances, then we are looking at a resource that is particularly important. We would have to devote an entire series of lectures to the discovery of this individual, Joshua Steele, to cover adequately his life and times. That would be an almost impossible task to achieve within the scope of my presentation this evening. In any case, however, our purpose here is primarily to open to our Barbadian public the marvelous resource that we have in the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. As we gaze into the museum's historical past, and we look at advances and we looked into the 1960s, we are again reminded of the fascinating panorama of Barbadiana that is covered in the pages of the journal. So far, we have been talking about the editors, and thus, just before surveying this later period, let me give you a list of the editors over the last few years. I have a list of them here. We have George Sharp, and ignore the volumes on the other side because that has to be completed. Miller and Saint, that's Sir John Saint, well known in Barbadian history. And by the way, I used to work at the West Indies Cambridge station many years ago in a previous life, let me call it like that. And Sir John Saint was one of the names very closely associated with agriculture in Barbados, and particularly with respect to the whole question of sugar breeding and the discovery of new varieties of sugarcane in Barbados. We have this down 1945. We have well in 34 we have Miller. We repeated Sir John Saint. We have Sir John Saint. We have R.W.E. Tucker, C.A.L. Gale, 1945 to 1948. J.W.B. Chenery, 1948 to 1960. J.S.B. Deere, 1961 to 1968. Then we have Peter Campbell. And I just spent a moment there because apart from Dr. Watson, Carl Watson, who is, as I said, the longest serving editor of the journal, the one major figure in the journal over the years is in fact Peter Campbell. And when I first became aware of the journal, it was Peter Campbell, in fact, who was a mentor to me as I began to peruse his pages and seek information on Barbadiana. And then, of course, after Peter Campbell, then we have Anthony Phillips, and he again too was a mentor. I'll never forget that he was the one who I had left a very rough draft of some of his writing on a desk, and he found it, and immediately proceeded to tell me, "But Pedro, you know you need to present this at a seminar." And then later on, he prevailed on me to write an article for the journal. So these are important persons. And then of course I said Carl Watson, who had the longest sojourn at the journal. And I believe that one of these days, Carl, I don't know if we'll be able to put a statue or a plaque or something, but we have to acknowledge this long history that's represented in these names here. Let's want to stop for a moment just to give us those names, because we're talking about editors and you might want to know who these persons are. So let me continue. Since I'm on the list myself, that I just shared to you, it might be unethical for me to single out any one person for special mention. And again, I point out that the extended service, some notice of extended service must be given to those who serve longest. And Peter Campbell and Carl Watson are the two longest serving editors. The position of editor is an honorary position, unpaid. And to maintain the high standard the journal has achieved over the years requires major effort. Thus, we applaud those editors, and I remove myself out of that picture. And we applaud those editors who have kept the journal going over these many years. And with that aside, I now peep into the further coverage that is under our microscope. I know the time is limited, so I'm trying to move on and on. Early in 1962, the editor of the journal turned the spotlight on the decision of the McGill University of Canada to establish a research institute in Barbados. And the entry on page 44 of volume 19, February 1962, reads thus. In 1961, the Faculty of Engineering of McGill University conceived the idea of establishing in Barbados an experimental station for studies in the use of solar and wind energy. A research center at the Belize Institute is now being built to investigate the means of desalinification, and we will say desalination nowadays, of seawater for use in the irrigation of arid lands. Given the contemporary move today towards use of alternative forms of energy, this article makes for interesting reading, especially when one notes a strong connection between the pioneering of domestic solar water heaters in Barbados in the 1960s and this McGill initiative. I remember as a youngster myself, going with my mother down to the Brace unit there, I think near Folkestone in St. James. And it's there that I heard about some of these early discussions. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. James Hudgens, who's a current director and founding member of the Solar Dynamics, he had discussions with the then Father Hatch. And I think there was a group called CADEC, Christian Action for Development in the Caribbean. And Father Hatch is one of the persons who knew about this McGill University enterprise. And in fact, the results of those discussions with James Hudgens led to the initial primitive but effective early development of water heaters in Barbados. I put this article in here, this extract in here, just again to illustrate what we may call the prophetic insight of the journal as it seeks to educate the Barbadian public. The editors also turned their attention to other aspects of technological development and also to various topics in natural history and social and political history. Thus, in various issues of the journal, as for example, in the journal, in the volume, this is now 29 of August, or 19, I think it is, of August 1962, we find articles by the author Edward T. Price on various topics. On pages 47 to 52, he pens the red legs of Barbados. And on pages 119 to 157, there's the article by the same author, Notes on the Geography of Barbados. It's clear from such presentations that the editors are prepared to meet a very wide range of popular and academic interests. Thus, we also find in a journal of November 1963, a detailed presentation by Dr. Jerome Handler, later Professor Jerome Handler, whose later works on free colors and on plantation slavery in Barbados will become essential sources in an expanding Barbadian historiography. Handler's presentation and historical sketch of pottery manufacture in Barbados represents perhaps the most comprehensive historical survey on any subject to have been published in the journal up to that point. Handler would go on to write other articles over the ensuing years, including articles on work organization of the plantation of the 1960s. In that context, we note that the journal had clearly developed as a reputable destination for the writings of various sociologists and historians, local and from outside of the island. The 1970s, which marked the penultimate period of survey in this presentation, because we're going to move to after the 1980s and then just say a brief word about our contemporary period. The 1970s, which marks this penultimate period of survey, represents a major advance in the craft of the editor. This is the period of Peter Campbell. Campbell served for some 18 years and made an indelible mark on the journal's content and editorial history. The main point to make at this juncture is that quite apart from his function as editor, we see Campbell as a major contributor to the journal as an historian and author. In several volumes, we find him authoring the following articles, among others: St. Anne's Fort and the Garrison, the Barbados Militia, 1627 to 1815, Barbados, the early years. In addition to these gems, Campbell also authored articles detailing the history of the vestry system. We might thus inscribe his contributions as paving the way for the modern journal as we know it today. So now as we proceed into the 1980s, where we find a further development of interest by prominent scholars and historians in other fields, while work is being made for other contributors to add to the material, available to a growing and more diverse readership. Where we find this development of interest, we also find that the journal is keeping pace with its audience, with its readership. Thus, we find in the volume of 1981, this is volume 36, number 3 of 1981, there's an article, Sugar and White Servitude. We've already covered a piece on white servitude earlier, but the author of this article, then Dr. Hilary Beckles, now Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. This was in the early days of his connection with the university. He joined the Cave Hill campus after a stint at the Mona campus in Jamaica. And this article marked one of the first attempts to subject the period of transition to slave labor in Barbados to an updated historiographical survey. Here, the casual reader will be exposed to what the professional historian was already quite aware of. That is, in the early years of the Sugar Revolution, white indentured servants were used in plantation labor, sometimes alongside enslaved Africans. To borrow from Professor Beckles himself, the planters held the view that the indentured labor was a form of capital investment which had to be fully exploited. And since the field gangs represent about 80% of the labor force, the employment of mixed gangs with Africans posed in this period no contradictions. As we continue, we've come across another article in the 80s, one entitled Barbadians and Barbadian House Forms in the Brazilian Amazon, authored by Sidney M. Greenfield, then professor of sociology and anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. In his article, he exposes the reader of that edition of the journal to an otherwise relatively unknown migration of Barbadians to Brazil. In this regard, we might note that there have been other contributions about concerning migration in our journal. Basil Mon writes on the migration to Cuba. Velma Newton wrote on the migration to Panama. Sharon Milagro Marshall has written on migration to New York. Of course, she's published work on migration to Cuba, but in the journal, she's written on migration to New York. And we've had, of course, yours truly, I've written on the question of migration to Suriname. Such contributions have helped to make our journal an important stop in the discovery of our ancestors' journeys away from Barbados. However, illustrious predecessors like Professor Greenfield, Sidney Greenfield, they paved the path, they laid the path for some of this later historiography. We're moving rapidly towards the last lap, but another contribution from the 1980s came from the pen of the late Warren Alley, who from time to time graced the journal with his meticulous research on items that had hitherto been understated. In one of volume, this is volume 37, number 4, he writes about the so-called ragged schools of Barbados. Earlier journals, dating back to the 1940s and 50s, had devoted some time to the saga of James Young Edgell, a Euro-Barbadian who was a convert to the Moravian Church in 19th century Barbados and was a pioneer in the delivery of welfare support to the recently freed enslaved population in the 1840s. One of his major contributions was the introduction of ragged schools in Barbados. Warren's article then is invaluable in pointing to this very important contribution to the education of the working classes. You may expect further discussion of this phase in the post-emancipation of development of Barbados in journals to come. As we close that survey that takes us into the 1980s, we take a quick snapshot of the content of volume 38, number 1, 1987. As we may recall, the journals, the articles, the editor of the journal had declared a willingness to consider publication of articles dealing with the old Indian communities. That was in the very early stage of the journal's development. Now in this journal, Peter Campbell, the illustrious Peter Campbell, is going to tell us, and we have a quotation here, we are glad to publish articles on the archaeology of Barbados because we are proud, and I want us to note this, we are proud that this journal should be widely recognized as an important source for the study of history, the history and prehistory of Barbados. But we certainly hope that it will not be long before this journal can publish and the museum can illustrate Barbados's archaeology and its prehistory in a form more readily intelligible to the layman. In other words, what he's really saying here is that some of the material is quite technical, but this further illustrates the journal and its wide compass of things Barbadian and things Caribbean. In the context of Campbell's statement, we can applaud then the article by Harry Beaumont entitled Notes on Barbadian History, and that by Peter Druitt, with Mary Hill Harris and Caroline Cartwright, entitled Archaeological Survey of Barbados. In the same edition, we find the article by Carol Watson, Pawns of Empire Builders, the Caribs of St. Vincent. This offers a brief look at the presence of our indigenous neighbors in the neighbor island of St. Vincent. In these presentations, then we foresee the continuing commitment of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society through its journal to the continuing education of Barbadians and others. And this contribution, this education, is as to the rich and varied history contained in the Caribbean Sea. Today then, as we come to a close, I have holding in my hand currently some of the more recent journals. As I have already informed you that Dr. Watson preceded me, and so therefore plays a tremendous role in the shape of the journal over the years. His particular interest in the bird life of Barbados is noted. I assume that at some time in the future, he will again grace us with some other presentations on the bird life of Barbados. I must tell him that I recently saw on a telephone post on a wire outside my house a bird which I think is called a kiskadee. Now I don't know too much about this bird, but I think it has to do with what some of the bird makes. And some of these birds I'm seeing around are certainly not birds that I was familiar with. More recently, I've been seeing back in Barbados again some garlands. Now, for some time, you haven't seen as many of them, but they're there. But that kind of material you will find in journals as you go through the end of the 1990s, right into the early 21st century, as we look in the journal. More recently, I wish to point you to a journal of December 2021, when Marcia Nurse is writing for us on the question of Nanny Grigg. Now I use this one to bring an end to our discussion this evening, because I think that too often one of the problems that we face is that there are people who think they know. But were they to have read our journal, then they would discover that they don't know. And they would discover that there is value in making the journal a must-read in their investigations. Marcia Nurse wrote an article called Links Between the 1816 War and Simmons Plantation of St. Philip. And this is in the Journal of December 2021. I was editor of the journal, and when I saw the article, I immediately recognized its value, because in this article there's a detailed investigation of enslaved people, including one of them known as Nanny Grigg. Many of our activists today are anxious for us to promote Nanny Grig to be a national heroine of Barbados. But I would suggest that before they go too far in that direction, and I'm not denying that she plays a part in the 1816 rebellion, I would suggest that they read Marcia Nurse's article that is penned from page 176 to page 207 of the Journal of December 2021. It is vital that they read what the journal has presented. And then the very latest journal that we have, and incidentally in this journal, we also graced by the presence of Dr. Carol Watson also in this journal, Carol Watson and Frederick Smith, music and sound in the early colonial Bridgetown market, pipe stem, penny whistle and shell horn, recovered from archaeological investigations at the Jubilee Garden site. And in this journal as well of December 2022, the last journal that we produced, we have in here of the drinks of Barbados, the alcoholic beverages available in Barbados in the 17th century. Notice this is before Cockspur. It's before the other wars that you're more familiar with now. Before Montgay, Montgay would have been around, but not known as such in this way. In this journal, we also have an excellent work by Philip Vasili about a Black Barbadian migrant who leaves Barbados and goes off to England. And Vasili traces his activities there and then gives it back to us in the form of this article here. Incidentally, I'm working with a group from England who, when I mentioned this here, are seeking permission from this journal, from the museum, from our publications committee to republish the article. Because Philip Vasili was a member of the Moravian Church in Barbados. Incidentally, not Vasili, so I'm sorry, the person of whom he's writing. Incidentally, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, were also members of the same Moravian Church, the Clifton Hill Moravian Church. So as I read and edited that article, I was reminded of my own heritage. So I close today by saying to us, the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, in its over 90 years of existence, has more than aptly supported the view that it is perhaps the most important series of publications anywhere in the Caribbean to this day. And I don't say English Caribbean, I say in the Caribbean. I'm not aware of any other similar publication that has the spread and the coverage of this. So to my friends, to those who have been looking on from overseas and elsewhere, I thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you. I'm trying to find.
Dr. Watson, you're muted. You have to unmute.
My vocal now, can it be heard? You're hearing me? Perfect.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
let me repeat. Sorry about that.
Yes, we're hearing you now.
Technical flaw. I'm an 18th century historian, so I live in the pre-computer era. So I hope I'm forgiven. Well, let me repeat. I I want to thank Professor Welch for that wide-ranging and comprehensive overview of what, and I reiterate, I agree with him 100%. When anybody asks me, if I'm interested in Barbados and Barbadian history, and Barbados within the context of the Eastern Caribbean or beyond, what do you recommend that I read? And my answer always is, anything you could possibly ever want to find out about Barbados either has been covered in previous journal issues or will be covered in future journal issues. It is without doubt the most important resource series of volumes, multi-volumes, relating to all aspects of Barbadiana history, natural history, art history. Well, of course, Professor Welch couldn't mention everything, but I, for example, had the honor of publishing a very comprehensive overview by the director of the museum, Alessandra Cummins, on aspects of Barbadian art, etc. So there's something in the journal for everyone. And all copies are difficult to come by. I know that the museum does have on the way a process of digitization of the journal, which once that is completed, will allow people then to retrieve via their computers at home specific articles or download, I presume for payment, entire volumes of the journal. And I'm also particularly pleased that Professor Welch took time to mention the invaluable contribution that previous editors made in reproducing things like vestry minutes that are very difficult for John Doe and Jane Doe in the street to access, excerpts from the Barbadiana, the Barbados Mercury, those important newspapers of the past, and the invaluable Lucas manuscripts. So again, we thank Professor Welch for his wide-ranging talk this evening. And now I invite you, the audience, to ask Professor Welch any specific burning questions you may have, or if you want to make a short comment, you may do so. And if I read from this little blurb that I've been given to instruct people how one should go about this question of putting questions, you can either do it in the question and answer section in Zoom or in the comments section on Facebook. And once you type in these questions, they will appear in a format that we can see them. And then, of course, it would enable Professor Welch to see them and to give you the requested either elucidation or correction or comment on the specific area being asked. And while you're thinking about what you may want to do or what you may, a burning question you may have while you're busy typing this in, let me, as chairman of this evening's session, start the ball rolling by asking Professor Welch to comment on the balance necessary to bridge that gap between the academic professional, who of course writes the specific academic standard, and as Peter Campbell, the late Peter Campbell alluded to, Peter Campbell, whom I have the greatest respect for, he alluded to the fact that, for example, in articles submitted related to archaeology, they do tend to use perhaps esoteric terms that are familiar to archaeologists, but not to the wider public. So we maintain the standard of the journal, and it does have that unchallenged standard, as I would agree with Professor Welch, a preeminent journal of its type in the Caribbean. But on the other hand, how do we make it appealing for the average layperson, and how do we make it not just informative, educational, but appealing in a broader sense of the word? I'm not saying that in an intelligent sense, it should also seek not just to inform, but to entertain us. So I know what I attempted to do when I was editor. So now I'm going to put Don Pedro on the spot and ask him what as editor he is doing to bridge that gap between academia and what the layperson expects to see in this broad coverall journal. Don Pedro.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Let me begin by saying very clearly that my view is that it is not the business of the editor, so to speak, to impose on the professionals in the various fields some notion of what we may call some notion of simplification. Rather, I, as editor, believe that what we need to do is simply urge, but this is not an imposition, but urge those who are writing these very technical articles to pay very special attention to the language that they're using. That does not mean that they need to jettison the technical language, but it might mean that in some cases where the technical language can be rendered in easy to understand English, that can be done without sacrificing the integrity of the work. I certainly acknowledge what Peter Campbell was saying years ago, and that many of those who were involved in archaeology, and in fact, many of us as historians, that we use words and terms and phrases that are best understood by ourselves because we are part of a fraternity. And that fraternity, there's certainly things that we say. I found myself, for example, because there's a certain political correctness nowadays that we impose when you're talking about slavery. We know historians of today's vintage tend to talk about enslavement rather than slavery, and refer to the slave owners as enslavers rather than slave owners, etc. And we do that because it reflects what we call certain sensibilities that have developed over the years. But at the same time, you cannot, in all cases, avoid using what we consider to be archaic terms. So that, for example, if I am quoting from a document, as I did quote earlier tonight, and the document uses the word Negroes, I might do more harm by trying to impose a 21st century notion of race and class in my writing than if I left the word as it is, as a reflection of what people used to say. Of course, you and I both know that the word negro was a Spanish or Portuguese word, and it meant black. We know that. But of course, it has come into very bad company because of some of the other terms that I use, as an American nigger and other terms of that kind. But I just think that we're trying to do something here. We're trying to produce a journal that both reflects the very high standards that the professionals are expected to adhere to. But at the same time, we're trying to produce a journal that people, others outside of the field will still find of interest. And we do so by the variety of works that we deal with. So that I'm quite prepared to have the archaeologists produce their works, but then we also, in addition to that, we also offer other things. So if you have a difficulty with the article on archaeology, then you can shift to the article on the birds of Barbados, etc. You could do that. Okay. That's my response.
Yeah, no, well, that's a measured response. And I don't know, comparison is invidious, as Oscar Wilde said, but when I was editor, one of the things that I attempted to do was most of what I published was of academic quality, but I always reserved a couple of slots for the interested layman who came up with something that I thought would be of general interest for the broader public.
Oh, yes.
And so I think budding writers, budding researchers, and I also would allow students, like MA students,
Oh,
to
yes.
publish some of their interesting findings
Yes.
in the journal as a means of encouraging them so
Yes.
that in later life, they would have a foundation or something in their CV to say, my article was accepted for the prestigious journal of the Barbados Museum. You know, I always operated on the premise that you need to give people a chance to they put this amount of work in the research and so on. It may not have the sort of imprimatur of a PhD designation or what have you, but it doesn't mean that the work has no less validity. And I don't know, as I say, we're both different people. And of course, different individuals have different priorities in terms of what they choose to do as editors. But yeah, no, so thank you. I'm looking to see, if I'm at a loss now because I do not see any questions appearing on my screen. So I see Kay Hall on my screen raising her hand. And Kay, you have a question for us? Or are you going to ask a question
Yes, I
yourself?
do. Dr. Watson, perhaps it would be useful for people to hear from the editor's mouth, so to speak, the type of writer that the journal welcomes and the type of article, just to give people an idea of the range of publications which the museum has had over the years and which you would like to continue to have.
Well, I think Pedro will be the first to answer that. And then if he wants me to chime in as an addendum, I don't mind doing it. But Don Pedro, once again, the floor is yours.
Well, I wish to offer as what we call my exhibit A. I'm behaving as though I'm in a law court now, and I'm offering the evidence of what we do and the very latest journal that we have. And I would invite anyone to, as it were, to look through this journal. We have an article here by Pat Stafford and Dave Elsis. Dave Elsis, of course, is a very well-known scholar on the Barbados and the slave trade. Now, these are professionals. These are historians. We also have an article by Stephen Mans. Now, I mention this one in particular because Stephen Mans is writing about the internment of Germans in Barbados during the First World War. The thing about this one here is that he is a professor of German and global history at the university in England, Birmingham University. But the subject matter that he has here is a subject matter that would interest a person with even the most passing interest in Barbadian history. We also have in this article, in this journal, an article which is called making his stories not music, memory narratives, and ragasoke music. And I mentioned this one now here by Michelle Springer, an article which looks at the whole question of musical form in Barbados and does an analysis of musical presentation over the years. This is a fantastic article. She's not a historian as such, but this is a person, a cultural, well, let's call it a cultural practitioner. That comes into the journal. We also have in this journal as well, My Brother Has Gone to America. This is by Sharon Milagro Marshall. Many of us would know that Sharon was formerly, I think, a media practitioner, but I think she was with CBC at one time. Now she's written 2 books on migration to Cuba and from Cuba to Barbados, and now this article is on migration to America. And we have an article by Michelle Hickson Cox on Barbadian visual art. What I'm really saying here is that the journal, we invite articles from a variety of interests. It is the purpose of the journal to solicit articles on every aspect of Barbadian culture, its art, visual art, its literature, articles on its history, its geography. And there's simply no area of Barbadian or Barbadian life that we will sneer at. We invite persons with a wide variety of interests. I have one article which is probably going to be published in the next journal, and this is by a gentleman who is a journalist, more or less. And I give you a little preview. He is writing about an American outlaw who eventually ends up by being buried in Barbados, escaping from America and coming to Barbados.
In Westbury Cemetery. I know.
Westbury Cemetery. So there's absolutely nothing. And I would say, okay, the only thing that will limit us from thing is, of course, the article, there has to be some adherence to standards of writing, grammar, etc., and once those are adhered to, bring them on. We are a journal for the people, of the people, by the people.
And as I say in Jamaica, stick a pin there. I was going to come back to a point that you made at the very beginning when you were talking about the first volumes of the journal, reflecting the undoubted elitist background of the people who were involved in the first formation in museum, etc. Like they were interested in publishing pedigrees of upper class families. Well, no, DNA has both popularized genealogical research and made it democratic, and also provided the opportunity to prove scientifically that sometimes somebody who may be dismissed as being exceedingly low-born is actually genetically, blood, bone, marrow, connected with those at the very top. You know, history has, and reality, human relationships have strange twists and turns. And so I would like to see in forthcoming volumes of the journal, perhaps a refocus on Barbadian genealogy. You know, Barbados has a very old base population of both the black element and the white element, going back to the middle of the 17th century. Certainly within this area of the Caribbean, we are the oldest population. And I've always advanced the view that by a coefficient of 2 in 1, we're essentially all related to each other. And again, when you do your DNA and you look at the 7,000 or 8,000 possible relatives that are thrown up. You'd be amazed at who you're related to. So I think it would be of interest to include some, because it comes back to this oft-spoken adage, all of we is one. So if you can prove scientifically that all of we really is one, then that helps to soften some of the sometimes rough edges of our social intercourse and interaction. And we get back then to the basic premise of science that we are, after all, Homo sapiens, and nothing less or nothing more than Homo sapiens sapiens. But I don't know. I mean, you said you want another Bird article from me, which I'm quite happy to produce. But I just did my DNA, and I'm surprised at who I'm related to, Pedro. For all I know, you and I may be cousins. We don't know yet.
Well,
You have to do your DNA.
Well, I just did my DNA with Ancestry.com. With Ancestry.com, and I am aware, I'm quite aware. You see, my grandfather was a very fair-skinned man.
Okay, yes.
And they used to, when he got angry, they used to call him Canes of Fire. That was his nickname, because he got very, very red when he got very angry, upset. I've been trying, he was the one who acquired the name Welch. And notice I said acquired the name Welch.
Yes.
Because he's born out of wedlock.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And but his mother gets married to a Welch in 3 years later. He's born in 1901, and his mother gets married to a Welch in 1903. 1903, yes. But I know he's a Welch because there's certain what we call phenotypical descriptors that tell me he is a Welch. What I discovered that very often many of the people coming out of that first 175 years after enslavement is abolished, that very often they're reconstituting their families. And how they do that very often is that when they get married, you publish the banns in the church. 3 consecutive Sundays. Then by the time they do that, when they get married, then that becomes the name of the family. And in about nearly every case that I've looked at, people who are born out of wedlock, when they get married later, the name of their father becomes the name by which they're known through life thereafter. So yes, my grandfather, Vernon Pedro Welch, might well have been related, a descendant of William Welch, identified as an enslaver in the slave narrative of a man called Jeffrey Brace. He might well be related, so I don't know. We'll find out all that in due course.
Well, they will send you that. They're wonderful. They send you a whole series of hints and lists of names who share either second, third, fourth, up down to the 5th generation of DNA linkages with you. I mean, that they actually are related to you,
Yes.
And it's fascinating, and it sucks you in. It's really quite interesting. So a good article along those lines, I think, would arouse, because everybody at some point in our lives, we all want to go back, look back. We all wonder who were our ancestors, what did they do, what roles did they play, and the past in that respect, reaches out to us and calls us. So that's a great possibility to consider.
Just to close on that point, really, we have been having some articles which can look at the whole question of genealogy. Marcia Nurse again has given us an excellent article a couple of journals ago on her ancestry.
She's a great genealogist, yes.
Yes, and we have a number of them. We have a number of articles. We still get them. Martin Cox writing about the Cox family, which is a family that is traced right back to the plantations on which they were enslaved. So we do have, we have kept faith with some of the earlier vision of the early editors.
Yeah.
All that has happened today is that so we also have in our journal, as you know, we have now a more sophisticated historiography, which enables us to put to rest some of the myths of the past. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we are throwing out any of the old, what we call the old sensibilities. We still have room for articles on the planter families of Barbados, on merchant families of Barbados, on families of the formerly enslaved, the descendants, the whole potpourri of Barbados. So that's still available to us. Oh yes, most certainly.
Because one name I would bring to bear, I mean, Bobby Morris, Robert Morris.
Yes.
Bobby has spent years researching some of the more prominent old settler families, planter families of Barbados.
Yes.
The Piles, I saw he's recently published some on the Paris family and so on. And, you know, we need to be inclusive. The past may have been exclusive,
Yeah.
but in a modern world, we need sometimes to stretch out that hand and encourage inclusivity in a different respect, in a different way, you know? So it's good that you have underscored that in your view as editor and your mission as editor, that important role, editor of the journal, that you are very aware of the need to maintain this, not throw out the baby with the bath water.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
So now I'm back to square one because I'm sure the people out there with tons of questions, but I don't see any appearing.
Maybe it was clear enough. So if what was presented was clear enough, there may have no need for them to ask questions, but just to recommit themselves.
There aren't any more questions at the moment.
Yes. Okay.
Well,
Okay.
if there are no more questions, at least Professor Welch and I have had a little finishing discussion that we hope will shed more light on how the journal is viewed and the work needed to pull the journal up. And I would underscore the importance of the journal as a research item, a resource item, and a very important item for understanding the cut and thrust and the intricacies of all aspects that together create the country that we love so much, our island home, Barbados.
Okay.
Now, remember that this is an ongoing series in honor of the 90th anniversary of the founding of the museum and of the journal itself, the preeminent journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And the next one on our series next week will be on the topic centering community-led curatorial practices at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And the presenter on that occasion will be Mrs. Natalie McGuire Batson, who is the curator at the Barbados Museum for Social History and Engagement. So please, next week, tune in to the ongoing lecture series of the Barbados Museum. Again, I repeat, Mrs. Natalie McGuire Batson, and her topic will be centering community-led curatorial practices at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. I want to thank you all very much for having taken the time to listen to Professor Welch. And I must repeat what an honor it was for me to be asked to chair this session. Please do enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see each other again next week. Thank you so much. Goodbye. Over and out.
Okay.
Bye.
Have a good evening.